thanks a lot for having me here, and I'm extremely happy that there are so many students and that the whole hall is so crowded. And this is already the first thing that struck me when I got the invitation. I said, well, that sounds and looks like a nice small group because it says workshop. And after that, I asked Jan, okay, how many people are registered for this kind of small workshop? So do we have some group works or discussions? And he said, well, it should be around 120 people. I said, okay, so let's change the program slightly into a more lecture mode. And then the second obstacle was that I have a not so fancy title in my lecture, which is a lecture obviously today, which is not like sustainability or unsustainable development and current issues on emerging markets, but it simply says Introduction to Post-Keynesian Economics. So I again asked Jan, what about the audience? And he said, well, the audience might consist of some people who know post-Keynesian economics pretty well. And when I look here around in the audience, I might say that there are post-Keynesians around. And then he said, well, on the other hand, there might be some students who haven't heard anything about post-Keynesian economics before. So my task is now quite difficult because I have to somehow satisfy all your needs. On the one hand, I want to give you a short introductory overview of what post-Keynesian economics might be and should be, because I also hear very frequently now that people keep telling me, I've heard post-Keynesian is all around, but what is it actually? So I first of all have to really make those people pretty upset, because I'm not coming up with a clear answer. This is supposed to be post-Keynesian economics, but there are of course various strengths and also sub-disciplines, focuses, and so on. So we definitely cannot talk about one small and also quite narrow field, but it's a broader field of economics, of course. But it's united in some specific assumptions and views of the world, and that's supposed to be the core issue. So that is more or less what my short introduction into the topic is. So I hope that those of you who know all that I started with don't fall asleep, and the others are still into it when we come to more political and economic policy topics towards the end. And the third thing is that I'm announced as being at the University of Economics in Vienna, which is partly true because I'm teaching there one course, but actually I'm affiliated to this University of Applied Sciences right next to the University of Economics in Vienna, so it's not that far away. So I structured my talk today into like three main topics. The one is foundations and roots of post-Keynesian economics. And then I want to give you a view into endogenous money and financial stability, which is of course rooted into some of my core issues that I also have in my own research, so I want to link that. And the third topic, economic policy issues, emerges from two different areas and two different thoughts that I had. The one is that we should also talk about the impact of European integration and the possibilities and also needs that economic theory and policy has to play in that issue of European integration. Because it seems to be quite unsatisfactory what current economic theories offer us as a solution after to overcome the financial crisis and the economic crisis. And the second part is that I went through the program and I've seen that there are so many topics this time about China, India, emerging markets in general. So I also want to frame in the very end and give an insight of how post-Keynesian economics could also tackle those issues more in depth than mainstream economics is doing it. So in general, I try to give an overview always in kind of opposition of what so-called mainstream economics is doing. And when I'm talking about mainstream economics, I'm thinking of not neoclassical economics in the basics and roots, but also in what is supposed to be like all kinds of schools ending up in equilibrium. And that's how I want to frame it. I found this article and a small newspaper article and said, well, that's exactly the right time that we try to merge post-Keynesian economics with issues of development, sustainable or unsustainable development in China. And as I had the chance also to listen to the talk before, I could hear that also Minsky, of course, was mentioned, and how to adopt policies to overcome unsustainability in development in China. So the headline was, and still is, so I picked a newspaper article from the end of October stating China's central bank warns of Minsky moment as economy powers ahead, which is now the case that we have heard that China still offers quite high rates of GDP growth, but simultaneously the whole situation seems to get more fragile also in economic terms, not also in those social terms and environmental issues that were tackled before, but it also means that there needs to be an explanation why it might be that out of a boom phase, we suddenly face financial instability. And as Minsky is also always closely related to post-Keynesian economics, this is one hint of how we can also connect those two topics that we have today in the morning. So let's first go to our foundations, and I think this is a very, very brief overview of what happened after Keynes' introduction of the general theory. So whenever you open any kind of macroeconomic textbook, you see that you have three strands of continuous work with the work of Keynes. The one is implemented and integrated in the so-called neoclassical synthesis. That is something that every student has to, I think every student all over the world has to come across whenever he or she is studying economics, because I think there is two textbooks not integrating this analysis, but all the others more or less claim that somehow this is how Keynes was integrated into neoclassical economics. Neo-Keynesian approaches and post-Keynesian approaches. Neo-Keynesian approaches I state because we are always referred to an equilibrium solution in the end, and it's also an approach that is widely used or often used by central bankers to integrate monetary policies and the monetary theory into a so-called transmission mechanism. We will also tackle that very briefly. And the third approach is our post-Keynesian approach. So they did not start simultaneously, but of course the main branch was our neoclassical synthesis right after Keynes. So before I try to outline briefly where the main counterparts of post-Keynesian economics towards the neoclassical synthesis is, which you all know, I want to give you an outline of when was it that post-Keynesianism was kind of invented, the name. So you see the gap already when I say that post-Keynesians tried to discuss Keynes in another way than the neoclassical synthesis is doing it, and more or less as Hicks did it right after the general theory was published. Then you see that the name post-Keynesians and post-Keynesianism came up in the early 70s. So in between, it was just a new area, an area of research, but it was not like framed as a name, and therefore it was afterwards called post-Keynesianism after John Robinson and in the American Economic Association in New Orleans in this year, the term and the terminology was framed. Of course, I cannot mention all the major economists in this area, so I just picked very, very few, but just to give you an overview of what's happened afterwards. So we have then a distinction between American post-Keynesians and non-American post-Keynesians. So there was a strong discipline into whether the monetary branch of post-Keynesian economics in the United States. And therefore, I mentioned here Sidney Weintraub and Paul Davidson, who were mainly influential for this American and monetary part in that period in the early 70s already. So therefore, I mention them right now because afterwards I will also focus on monetary issues. I also noticed that in the afternoon you will also talk a little bit more about Kalecki, which is also connected to Post-Keynesian, so you have already more about Post-Keynesian modeling afterwards. So the main idea was that unlike the neoclassical synthesis, it aimed to be a strictly macroeconomic analysis and wanted to have, of course, coming up to the time framework we are now in, so in the 70s, but also especially in the 80s then, when the monetary branch became more vivid, a counterpart towards monetarism. So while monetarism framed economic monetary policy in the area of the 80s, it should be and it wanted to be a counterpart, and was therefore also driven mainly in the beginning by being a counterpart to mainstream economics. And this resulted also into the fact that post-Keynesian economics was never in this period seen as one specific and united alternative, because there were many economists trying to have not completely different but slightly different assumptions and started in many discussions, as you can also read again when you see the issues of different journals where all these arguments were also posted, various papers and counter papers, and again synthesis papers and so on. A very important impact is that post-Keynesian economics vividly claims to be more interdisciplinary and tries to be more open towards other economic schools of thinking, but also towards other disciplines, which means that sometimes you find papers trying to join political science issues and economic issues, or being more open towards especially institutionalism or towards critical political economy, all kinds of neo-Marxian economics. So there is a numerous set of papers who try and to bring back this interdisciplinary approach also into economics. And this also means that from this aspect, it's not only interdisciplinarity, which is a major issue in post-Keynesian economics, but also the idea of how to approach economics. So it's supposed to be not only or mainly driven by quantitative analysis, but it is always claimed that there should be also a strong strength in qualitative analysis. Might be case study approaches, and this also opens up in the discipline of economics, which is in the last years strongly related into econometrics, to open up new methods which are applicable in that economic theory. Whenever you want to get closer to how these different modes and methods should be applied, so there are numerous papers and also books from Sheila Doe, which is always claiming that should be an open system and how this open system can be transmitted into different kinds of modes of economic analysis. One economist, which is not mentioned here, but I always mention him because he's an Austrian, and usually when Austrians go abroad and want to know the names of some other economists, they say, okay, the Austrian School of Economics, and well, not Austrian School of Economics, but other economists. Then they come up with Steindl, which is an economist, which was an economist of post-Keynesian economics. But also, there was always the discussion, is Kurt Rothschild, which was a famous Austrian economist, part of post-Keynesian economics or not? He himself claimed to be a post-Keynesian economist at the very end of his life. In some of his articles, he said, well, I am as well post-Keynesians. And then we had numerous discussions of if that is true or not, because he was more strongly involved into estimations and did a lot in forecasts, and especially at the time when post-Keynesian economics was asking itself, should there be a lot of quantitative analysis? Should there be a lot of estimates and forecasts, given that there is uncertainty and not everything can be set up in numerical terms? Rothschild was more or less said not to be a post-Keynesian economist. So after giving you those names, I also want to show you again on this very well-known setup and slide coming from a book from Marc Lavoie, The Introduction to Post-Keynesian Economics, where he clearly shows the distinction between heterodox and so-called mainstream economic schools. So on here, the right-hand side, you see the synthesis and neoclassical synthesis again, and here on the left side you see post-Keynesians coming up after Keynes, but you also see that there is an impact where you have Kalecki coming in, Schraffer coming in. So lots of also classical economists, as we see the classical authors being in the very beginning, having an impact on the further development of economic schools. And in here you see in the end French Regulation School and post-Keynesians, they are strongly or partly interrelated when it comes to specific terms and specific papers, as they try to be more interdisciplinary. But the clear distinction is that whatever we have in so-called neoclassical synthesis is part of mainstream economics, and that's usually where students start whenever they have macroeconomics. They start with the Hickesian or then Samuelson version of the neoclassical synthesis, almost no matter which textbook they use. For example, when you see here Samuelson, then generations of students have been going through the Samuelson Nordhaus economics textbook, which is one of the first ones that implemented this dual system of having neoclassical synthesis in macroeconomics and more neoclassical analysis in microeconomics. So that's how the whole situation also came up. I know that you might not like lots of graphs, but this is just to give you the overview of where is the starting point. Snowden and Wayne having this very elaborated book on macroeconomics. And in one of their first chapters, they give a very nice distinction between mainstream economics and Keynesian approaches. And what you see here is how a classical model would determine an equilibrium. And we see that we start off, and that's for me an important part here, that having an aggregate supply curve, which is our vertical aggregate supply curve, stating that actually we have underlying here Say's theorem on the one hand, and on the other hand we see that whatever we try to apply has no impact on the real world, has no impact on GDP here, output level. But we claim that everything is supposed to be supply-driven and not demand-driven. And this also goes hand in hand with the underlying assumption that we should first start to save money for some kind of capital accumulation, and then we can start to invest. That's kind of the starting point that you have whenever you start with neoclassical economics, and you end up in an equilibrium. So all markets are in equilibrium, also the labor market is in there, so that I think this is very well known. And that is the end how in our neoclassical synthesis the implementation of a very old, that's why it has this not so bright colors, a very old textbook by Felderer Homburg, which is a German textbook, and tries and lives off this multi-quadrant modeling, somehow trying to involve all kinds of different markets and ending up showing us the model of a Keynesian version integrating in our four-quadrant model, again in equilibrium, but we start to have here the ISLM modeling, and we know that under this ISLM modeling we have on the one side our assumption on the goods market that we have investment equals savings, which is then interpreted as being at least ex post also valuable for Keynes. And on the other hand, we have our market system and money market. And on the money market, we start off again with our vertical aggregate money supply function, leading to a downward sloping aggregate demand function on money. And therefore, we can derive this LM function for the money market. So this is the starting point of the neoclassical synthesis modeling. And now the question arises, is that what we have in neoclassical synthesis, which we claim is not supposed to be Keynes and is not supposed to be therefore post-Keynesianism, how can we try to offset this approach of our monetary theory that lies behind that? And as I said, my focus is going to be today on in the first step on this monetary approach. We will start off with trying to solve the issue of why our LM function should not be the one that is used in post-Keynesian economics. So again here, to wrap it up, our main concepts in post-Keynesian economics start off with effective demand. There is involuntarily unemployment and unemployed persons, so we do not end up in a market equilibrium. We again do not have the idea that there is ex ante something that is savings equals investment. Why? Because we know that we are strongly driven by that, and this is also the main cause and main reason why our money demand function and money supply function do not work the way we have it in standard economics. So the idea is that you have lots of dynamics, and in economic development you should be very keen on having some kind of stabilization policy. So there is an active state involved, which is not in line with our neoliberal claim of having a rudimental state involved. Functional finance and income is very functional income distribution is very important and has to be shifted, changed towards a stronger view on wage earners, because we know that when we have a distinction between capital income and labor income under the current system of mainstream economics, with this modeling that we have seen before, we always end up in having an equilibrium wage level, which might lead to no unemployment according to mainstream economics, but end up in having a very unequal distribution between labor and capital. And one very important factor is when taking all these into account, that there is an institutional setting that matters. And this institutional setting that matters come across because it is assumed that unlike mainstream economics, what counts is on the one hand historic time, and on the other side also some kind of space and specific situations are important. Whenever we have our modeling in standard economics and in the neoclassical synthesis, we always claim that we can shift and reshift all kinds of curves, and we always start again with the same point, and we never have a development in time. And there is not something that we would consider as historic time, but everything that is here included can always be reversed. So once we apply that a specific situation is always linked to economic policy in a certain area, in a certain country, under certain circumstances of institutional settings, you can never ever reverse it and come back to exact the same situation. This, of course, makes it already difficult to draw lots of graphs which are of general validity for all kinds of setups, for all kinds of countries, and therefore sometimes is regarded as diminishing the results of economic policy claims of post-Keynesianism. But on the other hand, we see that as we claim that historical developments are very important, institutional settings are very important, this opens up a new research area where we see that case studies and comparative analysis, as I said before, adds towards a purely quantitative analysis. Also some qualitative instruments is a core issue which is integrated here. So when we try to apply this setup of institutional setting, historical time, the impact that we see that general mainstream economics might not lead to satisfactory results whenever we try to find a solution also to overcome the current or the past or the still ongoing financial or economic crisis. Then we try to go back to a theoretical framework and first try to see what is economic theory stating for monetary policy from mainstream point of view. So the starting point was, again, we should find a claim and explanation why is there something like a Minsky moment, observable suddenly, also from a central bank point of view. If, on the other hand, central banks or any kind of mainstream analysis would always claim that when there is a kind of short-term disruption, we will find a new equilibrium almost in a very short period. But here it is suddenly claimed that there should be some kind of inherent instability in the system. So somehow our standard economic approach that I showed before with our 4 or 6 quadrant modeling cannot explain what currently is also observable in emerging markets, and also central banks suddenly come up that this should be existing. So there is a gap between the viewpoint of theory and what is now believed also in economic policy. So as I said before, our 3 steps should then be the first to look at money theory and monetary theory in the background, how to overcome the setting of our LM curve and therefore come up with a new supply function for money or demand function for money, see how credit, loan and monetary supply and demand are interlinked, and then derive maybe new monetary policy concepts out of this adapted theoretical background, and of course add in a 3rd step the very important issue of financial stability, which is not tackled at all in pure mainstream economics when we always end up immediately in an equilibrium. Okay, so our new classical logic for our monetary theory is clearly stated as exogenous money, because we know that whenever we apply our vertical aggregate supply function for money, this means who is in charge of all of that? The central bank is the one and can also determine how aggregate demand for money is shifted. Basically, because the central bank has an influence via monetary policy to push more money into the market or to influence the money market via interest rates. So the idea is, as a starting point, we have the central bank followed by commercial banks. These commercial banks strictly do what the central bank suggests, so they strictly follow the lead and the monetary policy advice of the central bank, which means when it ever comes to lowering interest rates, central commercial banks would automatically take these lower interest rates, have more possibility to give additional loans, and therefore fulfill that, increase therefore our broader money that we have, and lead to easygoing investment and our increase in GDP or output level. So this would be like one of the logics in transmission of our exogenous money. Basically, in the beginning, monetary intervention was mostly done via money supply increases, so printing out more money. But on the other hand, of course, new developments show that it's easier for central banks to tackle monetary policy and also to come up with a quite satisfactory impact on inflation when they shift towards interest rate policies. Interest rates policies, on the other hand, are strongly determined by Keynesian approaches and not so much by neoclassical approaches. The background of this is that we also assume that we have a stable and determined money demand, which means there are not supposed to be very unpredictable fluctuations in money demand, because we assume that we are all rational thinking persons. We have trust in banks, so nothing follows here completely irrationality, and it's also not following ideas of speculative bubbles. So also in the long term, when we apply our mainstream economic approach and come up with a capital market efficiency hypothesis, this would also mean in the strictest sense that we do not have any room for speculation anymore. As this is not satisfactory, not even for mainstream economics, we have different rarities in our efficient market hypothesis when it comes to the capital market, and therefore it allows also for short-term, at least small speculative elements also there. On the other hand, lots of questions, relevant questions also for the financial crisis, are not answered. On the one hand, what actors and which actors have an impact on money supply, which actors are there, and which actors also have this impact on money supply. And on the other hand, terms like financialization and the strong and meaningful impact of financial markets are not tackled in standard economic approaches. Also, that there has to be a gap in investment between financial and real investment is not mentioned at all. Therefore, we see that at least after our financial crisis of 2008, and therefore it ends here in 2012, to show you the changes in development of different terminologies of money. So money 1 would be a narrow sense of money, and money 3 would be a broader aggregate of money. That whatever the central banks are doing might not result in what they expect, because in our very, very narrow sense of mainstream economics, we would assume that whenever we do some expansionary monetary policy, which then means that immediately central banks are tackling M1 and therefore lead to a strong increase in M1, would wire our multiplier effects that we also have in money multipliers done by commercial banks in standard economics and exogenous approaches, lead to a much stronger development of our M3 and our broader aggregate in money. But what we see is exactly opposite. On the one hand, we have a strong impact here on M1, so it seems to have an exogenous and very expansionary monetary policy set up by the central bank. But on the other hand, M3 developments seem to go down, especially immediately in the crisis. You see here the sharp increase on the one hand, 2008, and then the decrease in M3 in the crisis. After the first expansionary policy was partly reversed, and the first programs of how to get new and fresh liquidity into the commercial banks were stopped, we see that this was the immediately decrease also in M1. And if we would prolong it rather now with quantitative easing impacts of the European Central Bank, which is here powered up because this comes from the bulletin of the European Central Bank, we could see that there is a strong increase in M1 again via our expansionary quantitative easing program. So given all that, we are seeking for an alternative approach, and in this alternative approach we try to solve all these missing links that came up with exogenous money and all these problems in explaining what is really going on in the real world was observable in the last decade. And the basics which are given in this alternative approach is that it should be the other way around. So again, we still have the same cycle, that they are the main actors, central bank, households or companies, in trying to invest, trying to gain some money, and commercial banks. So the actors itself do not switch, but the starting point changed. The starting point starts not from a supply side, but it starts from the demand side. So it claims that given different expectations of entrepreneurs, different expectations also of households of how to set up their future life, they want to and claim for a higher demand for loans, and not the central bank being at the beginning, but the central bank rather being at the end of this cycle, trying to set up commercial banks with the respective reserve requirements to fulfill all the regulatory frameworks and institutional setups which are given in that specific case of a country that we are talking about. So it's not supply-driven anymore, and it's not money-based, but it's demand-driven and it's credit-based, and it comes and the whole system starts from a different angle. So demand-driven credit demand causes now money supply, and not money supply being automatically fully determined by the central bank. The central bank does therefore not have full control, because the expectations which are now exogenously given by for households or companies and any kind of entrepreneurs, they cannot be directly controlled by the central bank. So whenever it comes to money supply, banks have a strong impact on that, because they are now also modeled as a kind of institutional actor between households, companies, and the central bank. So far in our exogenous money view, our commercial banks were always viewed as institutional actors, but not acting actually, just transmitting what the central bank is offering them in terms of lower interest rates or in terms of offering more liquidity. Now the idea is that this is just working the other way around, and I know that the following slide might cause a lot of different problems and personal issues, because it's a four-quadrant modeling which is heavily discussed if it really shows what endogenous money can lead us to, and also tries to incorporate various views of endogenous money. But despite all these problems, it still seems to me as giving you a very concise view of where the whole situation starts, where it ends, and what the involved actors might be. So we should start at the upper right quadrant with our demand for credit. If here it's given our demand for credit 0, this would be an enlarged demand for credit. But this should resemble our demand-driven position. All the demand for credit for loans coming up from entrepreneurs and from households within a company at a given point in time. And this idea, what they want, is then transmitted into the area of commercial banks. So the lower two quadrants should resemble what is then happening within the commercial bank. Of course, now we have different views on endogenous money, having the one that says, well, commercial banks have also a very vivid liability and asset management, and therefore have a different view on what kind of reserves they might want to gain from the central bank, and other Post-Keynesians claim that this is not so strong, and the central bank has a stronger issue on the monetary reserves they have. It's also depending if the interbanking market is vivid here or it's not involved. So there, let's broadly say, two different strengths now here. The one is more on purely so-called horizontalism, and the other is called structuralism. But besides of that, I just want to show you right now how per se the situation of endogenous money should work. And therefore we have those two quadrants being there in the situation of our commercial banks. So the one would say, what kind of reserves do we have? What is our so-called loan and deposit line? Do our external and institutional setups allow to give all these loans which are demanded or not? And then in the next quadrant, we would come up with the residuum, saying we need some kind of additional reserves from our central bank, and therefore we request this amount of reserves from the central bank. The central bank provides, so this would be the idea of the central bank, the quadrant of the central bank. The central bank provides now this liquidity at a given interest rate. Now, for the moment, we do not look at this kind of several interest rates level that we have here, but maybe just at this one is where we bold here line stating at, for example, a specific reserve requirement given amount of liquidity given by the central bank. And then we have a markup here from the commercial bank. Where am I here? A markup by the commercial bank ending up at a specific interest rate. and ending up in this idea right now, which would resemble point in time, which is coming up with the result of showing us a more horizontal and therefore horizontalist point of endogenous money. The idea is now that the cycle starts on another position, not at the central bank, but at households. Central bank is not the first one to offer the money, but is the last one to put the necessary liquidity into the market to keep up with the requests of our households and businesses. Again, then in the end, we should end up with some kind of level that is more or less at least at the partial equilibrium with supply and demand for money, but this is due to the credit that is determined and asked. So credit supply equals money supply in the end of this cycle. Out for monetary policy, this is now a very short description of what endogenous money should be or can be, but what important in the moment is that it ends up giving us a more limited version of monetary policy. Although the policy determinants of our central bank are still fully there, the impact for our real world might be discussed. Because in between, you have on the one hand the markup by the commercial banks, on the other hand you have the position and the commercial bank as maybe vivid actor in there, plus you have the exogenous determination of expectations which cannot be determined directly by the central bank. So of course, when we have expansionary monetary policy, again, the general level of investment of interest rates could go down. On the other hand, there could be a reverse effect of our commercial banks in bad times having a higher markup and therefore trying to offset somehow the means and the idea of the central bank. Simultaneously, we could also claim that all the new liquidity which is now into the market is not transmitted into the real world as it is requested, or the requests of entrepreneurs and households are just decreasing because of the crisis and their bad expectations. So overall, such a kind of approach seems to offer a more valuable view on what happened in the financial crisis and after, that expansionary monetary policy did not necessarily lead to an expansion of investment, but this transmission mechanism was not working at specific levels. Then at the next step, we could also talk about monetary policy, but as time is like very quickly here, we should move on to the next part, because the even more important part, to come back to our starting point with the article and also our question of Chinese development and the Minsky moment, we have to tackle Minsky somehow. And this is the time when the question of financial stability or instability enters the stage. Because before, we had no question of instability, of financial instability in mainstream economics, as we ended up in equilibrium. Now, when we have the idea that there should be endogenous money, we can also increase and enlarge this concept towards questions of financial instability. So I tried to combine here 3 different approaches which are linked to post-Keynesian economics. One is stages of banking, where Victoria Schick and Sheila Dow did some research on how development of banking might also give an impact that there was maybe in historic times more exogenous money, and money became endogenous as banking and the banking sector evolved. So their idea is that whenever we have a very narrow and very regional fragmented banking sector, there is not a lot of interbanking market going on, there is not a lot of globalization going on, and therefore in these times and in this case, central banks could have a stronger impact on monetary policy and the connection between monetary policy and the real world. But as we have several stages, stronger interbanking markets, stronger involvement in globalization, banks can involve more strongly this actor as being a strong institutional actor and not being depending so much on the central bank and their liquidity. And therefore, as they move on, endogenous money became more important. So that's their approach. And therefore, it also claims that while we see this, we see also stages and periods where commercial banks are undergoing a strong mergers and acquisition procedures, and others face stronger financial problems, maybe others are too big to fail, and so on. So all these impacts that we have in line with the question of banking stability and instability can also be incorporated whenever we have this, again, historic point of view that we can also analyze with a lot of comparative studies of different markets and of different countries in various historic stages. And the second approach that we have here is the financial instability hypothesis that Minsky brought up. So his claim is that the most important thing, or very important thing, is the focus on the debt relation and the financial structure of entrepreneurs or households. So nowadays it's also transmitted into households when we want to have an explanation for the financial crisis of 2008, and it's quite often transmitted into the US housing market, claiming that lots of households had a strong increase in their debt situation because they they had to move into ownership houses, and house price increased and so on. But traditionally and in the beginning, it was strongly related to the entrepreneurial part, claiming that we have a strong boom phase, and in this boom phase, it is the capitalistic sense and the means of an entrepreneur to enlarge business and go on into new areas. And this also means that some producers, entrepreneurs, that started with a quite stable structure of financing, which is called a so-called hedge structure, where you do not have a lot of instability in the position and you can easily pay back your debt position, moved into a more speculative point of view. Not because they were not following the capitalistic structure, but exactly because they're doing it. And this also gives us, of course, a hint to what we have heard in the morning, that China is enlarging very quickly, has strong growth rates, because it's exactly this long growth, a period of a strong growth and a boom phase that leads lots of entrepreneurs towards a stronger speculative or even more unstable and therefore called Ponzi financing scheme. So they want to incorporate everything that they need to have in the future, most probably according to a business plan, which is still reasonable, but shows that in the first 2, 3, 4 years, you have a very speculative idea of how your whole project is going along, but pretending and having good expectations for the future. More and more companies are shifting into that speculative or even Ponzi financing situation. And what happens then, and this is also what is always called Minsky moment, is exactly the time where our framework and the macroeconomic indicators change. So it might be that suddenly a specific market doesn't show those price increases anymore as it did in the past. So the example here would be the American housing market, where everybody was expecting on future increase in the respective house prices. So if this doesn't happen, then suddenly your various financing structures become evident and the situation starts to collapse. But again, viewing that means that you apply a view of money as endogenous money and not exogenous money. You do not explicitly state it here because you're focusing strongly on the debt situation, but exactly this view on that money supply is credit driven and therefore the whole situation emerges, leads to the impact that this is also an endogenous money approach. So this is the one so-called cycle that we have here. So we have an upswing and a downturn due to these different kinds of stages of financing. And the second step that is underlying this is a so-called super cycle that we can also see sometime. That means that over time, again, we also apply historic time here, that we have stronger upswings and downturns whenever time emerges. So we have maybe small crashes, larger crashes, and so on. And this is determined by a shift in our institutional framework and institutional setting, which means that it's strongly related to what we see with the policy recommendations of Minsky. Again, it fits perfectly to what we have heard also in the beginning, in the morning, that China or India should relate on a stronger state, a big government. They should have a wage policy which also increases wages and is not promoting unsustainable growth on the back of workers. And the third part would be strengthening the regulatory setting and the regulatory framework of the financial sector. And this is exactly what I want to have a look at now, is what happened afterwards, after the financial crisis, something that we would recommend following Minsky, following the strategy that our institutional setting is very important. And the first approach towards this institutional setting is the so-called market-based and bank-based national financial systems approach. But before that, I want to give you also the two slides that I have from the Minsky supercycle that comes from Thomas Paley, but somehow for those two, both come from the same paper from Thomas Paley, but somehow the reference didn't come with this, so it might be, sorry for that. I will add it up and then. So this shows that the supercycle is therefore also induced more strongly because we have a lack of regulatory frameworks. We have institutional settings which are more and more weak. So when we try to relate that to the real world, what's happening, or what happened, starting from the mid-70s and early 80s, we see that on the banking sector, of course, we have banking directives in Europe. We try to deregulate not only in Europe but worldwide. We have a stronger impact on financial markets, stronger and new developments of financial derivatives, for example, which is this effect here that we see in financial innovation. On the other hand, we have this so-called loss of memory from some other big crises and crashes that happened in the past. So the accumulation of all these factors lead to the fact that we had a kind of weakening in our financial framework, and this weakening in a financial framework is in this graph shown when there is this lines that would be strong institutional framework with bold lines, then they become weaker, there are no weaker lines, and then there are dotted lines, which means that of course we have a stronger possibility for high growth rates, also something that we see in emerging markets where they try to adopt quickly to a neoliberal scheme of free financial markets, open capital markets, and also a global financial sectors. But on the other hand, it also means that our downturns become weaker and weaker. And to limit all that, we should have sustainable growth, not tremendous growth rates with high fluctuations, but on the other hand, we could also have a stronger stabilization policy and therefore diminish our downturns whenever we have the end of a boom phase. And we have always here a so-called Minsky moment when the boom phase turns into a recession or a downturn. So this means we try and have to think of how we can come closer to this institutional setup and proper regulatory setup for a specific country or for a set of countries like the European Union or the European Monetary Union. And the first step to get closer into that is always the analysis of what kind of financial system do we have. Because usually we have different national financial systems being broadly classified into so-called bank-based and market-based financial systems. So the one is rather relying on the stock exchange for the financing of companies as well as on credit. On the other one is more strongly related on bank credits for investments. So we have different kinds of classifications. Usually you follow the guidelines also of the World Bank data sets because they have lots of data on this flow of funds, control, ownership. So this what you see here, just speed up a little because I see time is running. So here on the left-hand side, you have those different areas of how you can determine national financial systems, and it is done by numerous studies in so-called quantitative factors, which are set up as a data set from the World Bank, plus you add up the regulatory regime as a kind of quantitative setup, a qualitative setup, and qualitative indicators. Because otherwise you cannot control for a kind of strong connection between the creditor and the firm, which means that, for example, in a bank-based system, this means that you have a company, and for maybe a decade or two, you always rely to one specific bank. This means that the bank has a strong knowledge of what is going on in your company. And when the company needs maybe additional money because they have hard times, usually it was the case that the specific bank that knows the company already for a long period is not immediately withdrawing all the financial funds, but maybe has the impact and says, change something in your management, change something in your strategy, but not withdraws funds immediately. Whereas whenever we talk about the so-called market-based system, we have rather a loose relation and connection between creditor and debtor, which means that in this case, of course, I'm withdrawing my money because I'm not interested into the strategic development of this specific firm. I have no relation whatsoever with this idea and the production topics of this company. So overall, I have a rather, oh, the time horizon is quite opposite. Oh, sorry, it's a next problem. We have a long-term time horizon in bank-based and a short-term in the market-based. Sorry for that. That gives, it counteracts my argument. Because that means that in the long run, you have more stable developments, but not so high growth rates when you look at in tendency towards a market-based, a bank-based system, whereas you have the potential of being more innovative, having quicker short-term loans, but therefore also quicker withdrawals in a market-based system. And this would end up in having more potential for higher growth rates, but also higher fluctuations. And therefore, you also request a specific regulatory setup to be in line with those two regimes. So on the one hand, when you have a very strong connection between banks and companies, that would also request that you have a very strong connection of the regulatory body with that specific commercial bank. And this is overall called protective regime. So you have also this, similarly as a commercial bank is doing it with a company, and supervisory board or body who is also having more direct emphasis on a commercial bank. Whereas when you have a more open system in terms of quicker money, higher growth rates, higher instability in terms of withdrawing it, you need a lot of laws and regulatory frameworks before, but you would never ever immediately try to intervene into that relation between commercial banks and specific entrepreneurs. So given those two different regulatory regimes, you have to add that to the specific situation that we have in the national financial system of that country. And in the end, you can, of course, classify that and structure it according to all kinds of means, but you end up with the solution that, especially for countries which have not a very strong tradition in supervision, or are additionally undergoing this process of stages of banking very quickly, as I showed you before, they have a tendency of having higher instability because they have no historic ties between the body of supervision and maybe the needs coming from the national financial system. And this could be observed in the so-called new member states of the European Union, which adopted, of course, all regulatory frameworks that we have from the supervisory bodies from the European Union. For example, all kinds of necessary frameworks like Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, and so on. So all these elements were incorporated, but additionally, they do not have a very strong tradition of different kinds of preventive or protective measures on their national level, because their banking system was set up very quickly and is quite new, and so most of their historic patterns were not set up yet. And this leads to a slight misfit and potential for instability. But what was done then on European level, when we take that together after the financial crisis? Do we follow also, do we follow our needs for example, a banking-based national financial system from a European level? Because that would be requested here. As we said, it should fit, and we should tackle our institutional setting. The solution is that some of the countries of the European Union, quite a lot of them, have a so-called bank-based financial system. So is that bank-based financial system also covered by the new responses of the European level after the financial crisis, or is that going into a wrong direction? If this is not fitting with the national financial system, we might not solve the problem of instability on the European level. So when we look at what was done, I put up the two major effects that were done. On the one hand, what was done was setting up a new framework of core capital requirements for commercial banks. So are these core capital requirements for commercial banks now, whether bank-based or market-based, are they protective or preventive? They would be rather protective. This would be the new Basel III guidelines, coming up with lots of buffers of core capital 1 and additional core capital that has to be acquired and set up in case of stronger fluctuations in the future. But the method of requirements did not change. So especially when we think of lots of post-Keynesian policy advice that you might have read in the past, there was always the request that we should switch towards a so-called asset-based reserve requirements. This was not done. So we have a move towards a stronger protective measures in these core capital measurements and basements and buffers that we put up. But on the other hand, we do not have a switch in the general attitude towards reserve requirements. We do not hinder speculative attacks. We do not hinder a securitization via implementing here our idea of Basel III. So we do not move into asset-based reserve requirements. We are still with our old regime. And the second thing that was implemented is the so-called banking union. Is the implementation of the banking union now fitting what was proposed and asked after applying maybe a Minsky? Is that a strong institutional setup as we would force it within a post-Keynesian framework? And what we see here, when we look closer into the three different areas and pillars of the banking union, is the third one, the European deposit insurance system, is not strongly implemented yet. So basically, what the banking union is doing is focusing on those two first pillars. So in a supervisory method, we see that there is in all countries of the European Union now a distinction between the so-called main and therefore critical banks, which can have, when they are too weak, can have a strong emphasis on the whole national financial system of that specific country. And then there would be rather not system-relevant banks, which are rather small banks. In Austria, we also have this decision already, who is to be a relevant bank and who is the non-relevant bank. And the effect was that, and therefore I give you here the specific numbers. We do not have to look in detail into the numbers, but the idea is setting up all kinds of banks and ensuring that these banks are additionally safe because they might have whatever kind of problem arising out of the so-called prudential supervisory problems that they come up with because they're investing maybe all in the same countries. They have lots and lots of risks according to their investments that they have. So we come up with these numbers of additional money and core capital that they have to hold, and it's similar to what we see here in our Basel III. So additionally to Basel III framework, also on a national level, on single supervisory mechanism, we talk about additional money and a core capital that has to be held by the commercial banks. So both elements, both core elements of the European Union, which were set up after the financial crisis, go into the direction of keeping more capital, but they are not going into the direction of what is here a direct setup of institutional settings. They are not going into the direction of what was directly meant by Minsky, claiming that there should be a stronger decision and distinction between investment banking and normal commercial banking and so on. So we are more or less trying to put on a European level one recommendation that fits for all economies, no matter what kind of underlying national financial system they have. So all these kinds of other, now I just picked them, what was always heavily discussed, where it came up, but only those two, the banking regulation reform from Basel II to Basel III and banking supervision in terms of macro-prudential regulation, were also set up in European level. And now my time is over, and I could not come to the emerging markets, but of course, well, sorry for that. Yeah. Thank you.